As demonstrated in the works of the founders of the New Chronology, the consensual version of ancient Egyptian chronology is most likely to be erroneous, which brings us to the question of when this false version first came to existence, as well as the entire erroneous version of Egyptian history that it is based upon. It turns out that its roots don't reach further back than the end of the 18th century, which is when the Europeans got their first opportunity of traveling to Egypt after several centuries of isolation. The Napoleonic army disembarked on the Egyptian shore in 1799. This was followed by the defeat of the Mamelukes in the famous Battle of the Pyramids. This is when the Europeans made their first acquaintance of the Egyptian antiquities, and the European scientists drew up a more or less detailed picture of ancient Egyptian history. Even though the deepest antiquity of the Egypt ruled by the pharaohs was considered obvious, exact datings had remained unknown, and there was much diversity in opinions on how certain events of Egyptian history were to be dated. For instance, there were supporters of the long and the short version of Egyptian chronology amongst the Egyptologists. The discrepancy between the two versions amounted to several thousand years. The datings suggested by the specialist for the dating of Egyptian monuments could differ by several millennia or even several dozen millennia. But is there a way to independently date ancient Egyptian monuments? It turns out there is a highly precise method that allows for dating certain events in ancient Egyptian history. In some cases, its accuracy reaches 2 to 3 days, and sometimes even down to a single day. An Egyptian zodiac is a drawing with a symbolical representation of the celestial sphere. The very name zodiac reflects the fact that the primary attention on these Egyptian drawings is focused on the zodiacal part of the sky, or the belt of the 12 zodiacal constellations. All the planets as well as the Moon and the Sun move along the zodiacal belt. It is naturally impossible to observe the Sun and the stars simultaneously. Nevertheless, the position of the Sun among the stars is easy to guess at dusk or at dawn, when one sees the bright stars at sunrise. Thus, the zodiacal belt is the stellar track set by the motion of all the planets, likewise the Sun and the Moon, as seen from the Earth. This fact was known rather well to the ancient astronomers who had used it for the creation of a rather special kind of celestial astral clock, where the zodiacal belt played the role of the clock face, and planets served as hands. This very astral clock was used for recording dates in Egyptian zodiacs. It was done in the following manner: the positions of planets as well as the Sun and the Moon would be symbolically drawn on the zodiacs, fixing the positions of planets in relation to the constellations. This disposition is in fact a horoscope, which is an astral representation of a dating. It turns out that if an Egyptian zodiac should contain symbols or planetary names, they serve to record a date transcribed as a horoscope. Planetary positions on the celestial sphere change rather rapidly, therefore, a horoscope is very soon replaced by another one. Recurrences do take place, but intervals between them usually equal centuries or even millennia. Modern calculation facilities allow to convert a horoscope into a date on the modern chronological scale. However, the answer might prove rather ambiguous due to the fact that very occasionally, a horoscope might recur. However, for most of them such recurrences are a scarce enough event in order to give us the opportunity to date them reliably on the interval of the last 2 or 3 millennia. The astronomical dating of the Egyptian zodiacs allows the assessment of reliable and scientifically validated reference points in the chronology of ancient Egypt. This is a modern copy of an ancient Egyptian zodiac. The astronomical meaning of the symbols used in Egyptian zodiacs isn't always obvious. In some cases, it only surfaces after a careful study. However, as a rule, Egyptian zodiacs can instantly be told apart from other ancient Egyptian artwork by the symbol of the celestial sphere drawn as a woman with her arms lifted above her head. This woman often has an unnaturally extended body that spans the zodiac. It is presumed that she represents the Egyptian goddess Nut, or the celestial goddess. Here one sees an ancient drawing of the zodiac found in one of the royal sepulchres from the Theban necropolis in Luxor. We see the figure of Nut divided in two. As we shall see from a series of examples, this means that the zodiacal belt is split in two halves. One sees two respective rows of figures upon the zodiac, one under the other. Here we see a fragment of a ceiling relief carved in stone, depicting a zodiac approximately 2.5 meters by 2.5 meters in size, from the Egyptian temple of Dendera. This is one of the most famous Egyptian zodiacs, also known as the round zodiac of Dendera due to its shape and in order to differentiate between it and the long or rectangular zodiac of Dendera, which was found in the same temple. The round zodiac of Dendera was discovered by the Europeans in 1799 during the Napoleonic expedition and later taken away to Paris. The original of this zodiac is kept in the Louvre nowadays, and there's a copy in the actual temple. Here one sees a drawing of the round zodiac from the description of Egypt created by artists who accompanied Napoleon's military campaign to conquer Egypt. The copy is a very accurate one, however, the artwork is modified to some extent. The original looks a great deal rougher. This is a modern drawn copy of the round zodiac. One can easily recognize the symbols of all 12 zodiacal constellations upon the round zodiac of Dendera. All the zodiacal constellations are drawn in the exact same way as one sees them in the medieval European books on astronomy. Another zodiac was discovered in the very same Dendera temple, the long or the rectangular zodiac of Dendera. Just like the round zodiac, it is a ceiling relief of a formidable size consisting of two halves. Each of those equals 25 meters. The decipherment and dating of the round and the long zodiacs was contemplated in a great number of works. In the 19th and 20th centuries they were studied by Dupuy, Laplace, Fourier, Latran, Home, Biot, Brugsch, Nikolai Morozov, and others. As a result, many various and, basically, equally arbitrary datings came to existence. The dating of these zodiacs thus remained ambiguous. The research of Anatoly Fomenko and Gleb Nosovsky has demonstrated that apart from the primary horoscope, the Dendera zodiacs contain auxiliary astronomical information which wasn't taken into account by previous researchers. Once the oversight is rectified, it leads to an absolute dating. Here is a drawn copy of a zodiac from the stone ceiling of an ancient temple in the Egyptian town of Esna. Let us refer to it as to the greater zodiac of Esna in order to distinguish it from the other zodiac, which was also found in Esna, but in a smaller temple. This is another zodiac discovered in the small temple in the north of Esna. We shall be referring to it as to the lesser zodiac of Esna. More details about these zodiacs will be provided later. Two zodiacs were found in an artificial Egyptian burial cave at some point in the beginning of the 20th century. The cave with the zodiacs was discovered by the English archaeologist Flinders Petrie during his excavations in Athribis, a site in Upper Egypt, close to the town of Sohag. 2 zodiacs were found on the ceiling of the cave, colored in different hues. Flinders Petrie provided a drawn copy of these, presuming them to date from the beginning of the Common Era. The zodiacs of Athribis were studied by the English astronomer Edward Noble for the purposes of dating, and then also by Mikhail Viliev and Nikolai Morozov. However, they had to go for far-fetching explanations in their attempts to decipher and date the zodiacs of Athribis. As a result, no single astronomical solution was found that would completely satisfy the symbols found on the zodiacs of Athribis. The research by the authors of the New Chronology has demonstrated that such a solution does in fact exist, and it is the only one possible. Let us point out that up until very recently no final dating of the Athribis zodiacs could be made, since the volume of calculations required for this purpose happens to be too great to be performed manually, without the aid of modern computer technology. Here we see an example of an Egyptian zodiac where the constellations are represented as usual symbols, and the planets as half-length portraits. This zodiac was discovered in the middle of the 20th century in the ancient Egyptian sepulchre of Petesiris, on the ceiling of the inner chamber. Not all Egyptian zodiacs contain horoscopes. Some of them only possess zodiacal constellation symbols without planets. Such zodiacs generally cannot be dated. The concept of dating the Egyptian zodiacs astronomically is far from new. In the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th century, when the Europeans had secured access to Egypt for the first time, they discovered a large number of zodiacs there. Some of the Egyptian zodiacs, the most impressive ones, were copied by Napoleon's artists and published in the description of Egypt. They are directly referred to as astronomical tables or sculptural zodiacs there. Thus, the astronomical nature of the Egyptian zodiacs has never been doubted. Quite understandably, one would come up with the idea of dating these zodiacs astronomically. However, since the astronomers had to conform to the orders of the historians, naturally they had to conform to their views on the chronology of Egypt. However, this is where astronomy came into conflict with Scaligerian chronology. No satisfactory astronomical date that would align with historians' expectations was ever found for the Egyptian zodiacs. According to historians, nearly all the Egyptian zodiacs date to the epoch of Roman rule in Egypt, or the beginning of the Common Era. In the earliest stages, attempts were made to date these zodiacs to even more distant epochs. Historians would try to date the Dendera zodiacs to an epoch preceding the Common Era by 15,000 years, no less. However, these exceptionally attractive datings of Egyptian zodiacs must have been complicated by the all too obvious similarity between the astronomical symbols used in Egypt and in Europe. In order to insist that Egyptian zodiacs predate the Common Era by hundreds and thousands of years, one would have to explain the reason why the drawings of constellations on these exceptionally ancient Egyptian zodiacs coincide with the pictures in medieval European books on astronomy in finest detail. It would be difficult to explain this. Dating the Egyptian zodiacs to the beginning of the Common Era would make the problem a great deal less serious, since this dating allows to make claims that both the ancient Egyptians and the medieval Europeans borrowed their astronomical symbols from the Romans, hence the similarity. Shifting the dates forward from the first centuries of the Common Era would also prove a non-option for the Scaligerian experts in Egyptian history, since the Scaligerian chronology is of the opinion that the history of the ancient Egypt ceases shortly after the beginning of the Common Era. As a result, possible, according to the Scaligerites, datings of ancient Egyptian zodiacs turn out hemmed in the narrow interval of 200 to 300 years, the longest, a century before the beginning of the new era, or possibly a century or two after. However, it turns out that this period has absolutely nothing to do with the astronomical datings of the Egyptian zodiacs. A calculating astronomer has no leeway to make the datings fit, since the same horoscope can only recur after prolonged intervals of time and happen once or twice a millennium. Some planetary combinations can only recur over the course of several thousand years. All these complications arose from the fact that the interval was specified wrongly. The result was that the Egyptologists basically gave upon the idea of dating the Egyptian zodiacs by their astronomical content. Discussing the symbolic content of the Egyptian zodiacs, they try to present it as astronomical fantasies of ancient artists, often not even trying to decipher and date the rediscovered Egyptian zodiac. However, not just any random planetary dislocation against the background of zodiacal constellations can be treated as a horoscope, which can really manifest on the celestial sphere. Planetary motion is subject to certain laws. For example, Venus and Mercury as seen from the Earth cannot be located too far away from the Sun, and hence from each other as well. A fantasy artist distributing planets across constellations randomly is most likely to break these laws and draw an unreal fantasy horoscope. However, Egyptian zodiacs contain real horoscopes. Why would Egyptologists resort to vague contemplations on the supposed mysticism of the planetary symbols on the zodiacs instead of analyzing their astronomical content and attempting to find the dates recorded within? Could it be due to the fact that they didn't even hope to come up with a solution that would correspond to the Scaligerian chronology? Indeed, none of the Egyptian zodiacs have such solutions. Let us take a look at what is written on the subject of dating Egyptian zodiacs astronomically in the description of the British Museum's Egyptian collection published in 1924. We find nothing at all. The authors report nothing about the astronomical datings of the zodiacs found on these coffins when they tell us about the alleged dates when the ancient Egyptian sarcophagi from the collection of the British Museum were manufactured, as if these horoscopes didn't matter at all. Each and every dating is given out of considerations that have got absolutely nothing to do with astronomical dating. For example, when the authors describe an allegedly mind-bogglingly ancient wooden coffin from Egypt, they tell us that the face resembles the face of the ordinary stone Sidonian sarcophagus, of which those of Tabnith and Eshmanazar, king of Sidon, BC 360, are typical examples, and for this reason the date of the coffin is supposed to lie between BC 500 and BC 350. However, in the same book we find the following description of the artwork that decorates the coffin lid. It depicts numerous astronomical texts and pictures. Here we have figures of the gods of the constellations, and of the planets, signs of the zodiac. In other words, what we have before us is a zodiac with a horoscope, yet the issue of dating this horoscope astronomically is ignored altogether. This is very typical. Not a single Egyptian zodiac out of those mentioned in the description of the British Museum's Egyptian collection was dated astronomically or so much as represented. There isn't a single word about such datings anywhere in the very detailed description of the British Museum's Egyptian collection. This is what Nikolai Morozov wrote regarding the zodiacs from Dendera.
The first Egyptologists dated the Temple of Dendera to 15,000 years before Christ. No less. Their children dated it to 3,000 years before the Common Era. And their grandchildren had to admit that the rectangular zodiac dates to the reign of Tiberius, 14 to 36 AD, and the round zodiac, to the reign of Nero, before 60 AD. When they tried to prove all these datings by astronomical calculations, the results obtained were negative. The consecutive works of Dupuy, Laplace, Fourier, Latran, Home, Biot and other later researchers demonstrated that the horoscopes in question cannot predate the 3rd century AD. One had to either date the imperial Roman reigns to a different epoch, also ascribing a different geographical location to it, or, alternatively, to declare the horoscopes pure fantasy. The Egyptologists were reluctant to revise the tradition and opted for the latter despite the fact that the veracity of both horoscopes is blatantly obvious.
After an attentive study of these zodiacs, Morozov makes the following conclusion.
Should all of the above to be artistic fantasy, it is very difficult to explain why both Mercury and Venus occupy their rightful position near the Sun in both zodiacs rather than winding up somewhere else, in a location convenient for the artists, but perfectly impossible. Nonsense. This horoscope isn't fantasy in any way, it is perfectly real.
Morozov had been the first to suggest dating the Egyptian zodiacs by their astronomical content regardless of the Scaligerian chronology. Whether or not it is a coincidence, but all the earnest attempts of the Egyptologists to use astronomy for the dating of Egyptian zodiacs ceased de facto after the publication of Morozov's works where he proves the impossibility of dating the Egyptian zodiacs the way Egyptologists want them to be dated. All the resultant datings are medieval. This contradicts the consensual chronology of Egypt. It has to be said that Morozov's works contained a number of minor flaws. However, there were a lot less of those in Morozov's work than in any of the ones that preceded it, since the authors of the latter would do everything they could, in order to make the resultant datings correspond to the Scaligerian chronology of Egypt. The works of Morozov prove that once the flaws are addressed, the astronomical datings irreversibly shift forwards, into the Middle Ages. Therefore, Morozov's approach to the dating of Egyptian zodiacs without accounting for the Scaligerian chronology appears to be a perfectly correct one. However, this approach runs into a new hindrance, and a significant one. It becomes manifest as soon as we expand the time interval of acceptable datings to make it span a millennium or more. The resulting dates are very ambiguous. The reason is as follows. Once we reject the a priori set narrow time interval for the horoscope datings, we must take into account every astronomical solution on the entire historical interval length, or roughly 2,000 years. This spawns several valid solutions for every zodiac, making it completely unclear how a single correct dating could be identified amidst a number of variants. One must point out that a great number of Egyptian zodiacs can be deciphered with no ambiguity whatsoever. The names of the planets are given in writing on some of them. These inscriptions can be read in order to realize what planet exactly this or the other zodiacal symbol stands for. Some of the planetary figures recur on different zodiacs and can therefore be told apart securely when compared to each other. Nevertheless, deciphering the Egyptian zodiacs always results in ambiguities of some sort concerning a planet or two, for instance. There are many reasons for this. Sometimes it happens due to the fact that the symbol for a given planet is new, and isn't known to us from other zodiacs. The condition of the symbol may also be poor enough to render it completely unidentifiable. It is also possible that a zodiac might not specify a planet's position explicitly enough. For certain zodiacs that utilize complex, convoluted or extremely abstract symbols, one has to go through all possible identification versions of the planetary figures, which results in dozens of possible ways to decipher such a zodiac, with several hundred possible solutions.